Hi, I'm Boris Blade. I'm the host of Strange But Harmless. Well, spring is just around the corner, so let's go fishing. Boy, as a kid, I loved to go fishing. If you grew up in my hometown, you know there are a lot of places to fish. Besides the Ohio Erie Canal running right through, there's also the creek as we called it. Now, I can't speak about today, but when I grew up in the 60s and 70s, it was pretty shallow, at least on the east side of town. It didn't get very deep until you got behind the shopping center downtown. It comes off of Long Lake, which catches all the extra overflow from the local lakes, if what my dad told me was correct. At some point, it joins in with the Tuscarawas River south of town and keeps going south. It gets pretty wide at parts after leaving town, as I recall. As kids, our favorite was the creek and the canal. Now, the creek down behind our neighborhood, as I said, was not very deep, but because it ran out of Long Lake, you never knew what you'd catch. On a real hot day, take a can of corn or some dough ball, and you could hook a really nice-ass carp. Now, they suck, but they put up a hell of a fight. Not those little orange ones, but the big old suckers after they change color. It was nothing to pull in a 2-footer. Catfish, too. You could go down there any night and catch little cats from 10 to 12 inches, or a huge sucker once in a while. Or you could walk on down the tracks to the canal. That's where you could catch some really big-ass cats. But the creek was good for more than just carp and cats, too. I remember on my 21st birthday, I went to Manda's, a local bait shop, and bought me my first brand spanking new rod and reel. Now, growing up in a house with two brothers and fishing gear not being a high priority on the family budget, I usually only got a new reel or rod if one broke, or made do with leftovers from my brothers, hand-me-downs, like a lot of my clothes. I usually ended up with a bastardized Zebco rig. You remember Zebco, don't you? I had so many Zebco reels over the years. Now, Dad and Mom did the best they could. And when I was in junior high school, Mom took a part-time job at Lawson's. But with 4 kids, it was pretty lean times, especially when Dad was on strike. That's another story for another time. So I buy me a new rod and reel. I have Manda string it for me. I bought some mealworms and minnows and headed to the Shit Creek, as it was lovingly known in the neighborhood. I go to everyone's favorite spot, sit down and start fishing. I started out with a crappie jig with a mealworm, just to warm up my new rig. My first cast, I caught about a 7-inch crappie. The next cast, a 9-inch crappie. Well, let me tell you, I really wish I had not been alone that morning, because no one believed me when I told them I had caught 24 keepers in an hour and a half. And that doesn't include the dozen or so I threw back. I had them on a stringer. Actually, I had to put 2 stringers together. I caught crappie, bluegill, a couple of rock bass, 2 smallmouth, and a 16-inch largemouth bass. I had a couple of cats 12 to 14 inches long on the stringer that day, and even a perch. Well, I heard someone coming. I turned just in time to see an old black man standing behind me at the top of the hill. He was carrying an old metal bucket and a 5-gallon plastic bucket. Both were sloshing with water. Both had fish in them. We chatted for a few minutes. I showed him my stringers, and he offered me $5 for my catch. I asked him why he wanted them, and he told me he liked to grind up all kinds of fish and mix them together. He'd make fish patties, then dip them in batter and fry them. Well, since I only wanted them to show off to my friends and was going to throw them away anyways, I gave them to him and told him he could keep his money. He looked like he needed it more than I did anyways. Now, Dad used to love night fishing, especially after a rain when bait was free. All you had to do was walk out in your front yard with a flashlight and pick it up. We always went to local lakes. Dad knew all the good places because he grew up in this town too. His favorite catfishing hole was behind the old Red Barn restaurant. Boy, you could pull some big old cats out of there. Then in the morning switch to red or mealworms, depending on what you brought with you. Dad preferred redworms. We would fish until the sun was above the trees and head home for breakfast and a nap. Of course, I rarely stayed awake past 1 a.m. Dad worked second shift and would rush home on a Friday to get us boys for fishing. We would make the lake by midnight on a good night. More stories about that later. Well, it's later. Night fishing. Boy, we used to love to go night fishing. Dad used to take us to the local lakes. He had several spots he'd like to catfish in. As I mentioned before, he liked to fish Long Lake by where the old Red Barn restaurant used to be. It was past the locks, but before where the canal runs past, and then heads to our town. We would set up our gear. We each had either a lawn chair or a chase lounge, the old kind with the plastic straps woven to sit on. We each had our own flashlight for watching the end of our pole. That's where I learned to tightline fish. Later on, Dad bought a Coleman lantern. It had a shield with a carrying handle on it to block the light from your eyes. We could set it right in front of our chair line, and we could all share the light, and the bugs that invariably were attracted to it. I remember many nights falling asleep watching the tip of my pole, sometimes imagining, or possibly dreaming, as I fell off to sleep, that my pole would bend down. I might sometimes have startled awake and tried to grab my pole just to hear my dad and brothers laughing at me. It didn't matter where we fished, we'd fish tight line for catfish all night, and then at first light we'd switch over to regular fishing for as long as they were hitting. We used to fish the local reservoir. Just before you got to Myers Island, there was a little stretch where large chunks of concrete lined the shore. Dad would park the car as close to the guardrail as he could. Us kids could barely squeeze out the door on that side. And we didn't bother with chairs. There was no room for them. You either sat on the guardrail or Indian style on a chunk of concrete. I don't remember doing very well there, but I remember getting a sore ass from sitting on cold cement. For some reason, Dad came back to this place every once in a while. We would waste a couple of hours there, then move to another spot. We sometimes fished a reservoir off of State Mill Road. We'd fish another reservoir off the other end of State Mill Road, too. There was a little spillway that ran into a little round pond. We'd walk up over the hill by the pond to get to the reservoir. Now, during daylight hours, you could catch bluegill in the little runoff pond. We even hand-caught baby catfish there once. We took them home in a cup and put them in our aquariums. One got big enough that it ate the rest of the fish in the tank. They were some of Dad's prettiest guppies, too. Good thing he never had to pay for them. We traded with one of my brother's junior high school teachers. Our orange carp that we hand-caught in the shit creek, with nets most of the time, for his home-raised guppies. He had several wading pools set up in his yard, and he was keeping the carp in them. There was also a little outlet off of Turkeyfoot Lake that Dad showed us. You had to go past the state park entrance to Catalina Drive. Where it dead ended, we would park and fish. It was just a little cove, but enough room for a few people if you didn't mind being a little cramped. My dad died February 29th, 1980, just 4 months prior to my 20th birthday. I missed out on a lot of advice he would have surely imparted on me. Put in a good word for me with God, would you, Dad? After I turned 18, my friends and I started drinking beer. Night fishing took on a whole new meaning. We went to the same places, set up our gear the same. We used Dad's lantern for many years after he passed. But add a cooler of beer, some herbal entertainment too, a radio for tunes, and sometimes a bunch of fireworks, and we were set for a fishing party. We would usually start a small fire, not for the heat, but just because we could. We added a few more distant spots to fish too. We used to go to Berlin Lake for crappie. There's a spot where a state route crosses the lake. We would park and walk down to the bridge area. Most people would line the bridge. They tied their lantern to the end of a long rope and tied the other end to the guardrail, dangling the lantern down to within a foot from the water. They would drop their line straight down next to the lantern, and they would use minnows, worms, crappie, jigs. It didn't matter. The fish were attracted to the light and would hit on anything that dropped in front of them. I saw a guy using a piece of foil from a gum wrapper once. He caught 4 crappie before he lost his bait. Well, we set up at the end of the bridge, dropped our lanterns, and walked down the concrete embankment to just under the bridge. And we cast out from there. Not only to our lantern, but from there we could cast out as far as we wanted using other nearby lanterns to fish by. We cleaned up. We also liked to fish a spot behind a local auto auction under an overpass. It didn't yield a lot of fish, but you could get pretty loud there, i.e. drunk, without the neighbors complaining. Now we still fished the local canal in town, only now we fished where we could reach by car. A favorite spot was down under a local viaduct. We would drive under the bridge where the old street crossing used to be and fish across the canal from an old Dutch tavern. No one there to complain but bar drunks. But believe it or not, the cops did come down a few times and have us turn down our stereos due to bar patrons complaining. Okay, in case you haven't figured it out yet, as a young adult, I wasn't the best person I could have been. I haven't said a lot about it up to this point, but I have to break that ice sometime. One of my favorite things to do when I was young and stupid was, well, first let me explain something about myself. I like fire. No, not like that, but for years my close friends would call me Pyro Boars at appropriate times. I could start a fire just about anywhere under most conditions. Yes, I cheated at times. I collected cool stuff. Anything I see is cool. As a preteen, I acquired in my travels a flint fire striker. Now, I usually had some kind of tissue or other easily ignitable substance in one of my pockets. I would hide it amongst the kindling I was trying to start, strike the flint a few times, and voila! fire. When I started driving, I carried stuff in my trunk to help accommodate my fire starting needs, stuff I could incorporate without all but the most prying eyes noticing. Most of my friends to this day would be surprised to hear this. I had an old metal bucket with cut up oily rags in it. I kept blue tip, strike anywhere matches in a baggie. Later, when I got wiser, I got a magnesium and flint fire starter kit. That really made it easy. Why am I telling you all my secrets? One bad thing I did a couple of times before we left a fishing spot by the local bridge was to throw an old tire on the coals when no one was looking. We usually let the fire burn down the coals prior to leaving, but would let the coals cool naturally. We'd put beer and wine bottles in them so that when we come back the next day to get the bottles, they were melted. They took on some pretty cool shapes too. Now the coals were surrounded by dirt and there was little chance of anything else catching fire, so I would secretly throw a tire on the coals as we were leaving. By the time we got back around and up to the bridge, it would be engulfed by a thick black smoke. At least a strip 20 to 30 feet wide would. I know now it was a crappy thing to do. I felt bad the last time I did it because the fire department was called and they were racing to extinguish it. I realized that my foolishness could have cost someone their home or even worse, their life. I never did it again after that night. Then there was the lake downtown, the only place in the area where you didn't need a license to fish. You could go dig worms in your garden, grab your pole, hop on your bike, and ride to the good old lake. You weren't really allowed to fish there at night, but we never got chased out back then. I'm sure if you were there after dusk nowadays, someone would call Johnny Law on your ass, though. It was good for more than just catfish at night, too. You could fish there any time, day or night, and catch something. We caught bluegill, crappie, largemouth, smallmouth, rock bass, perch, catfish, carp, walleye, muskie, trout. I even saw a guy pull a salmon out of there once. Now, not all the fish in this lake were native to it either. I knew people in the 70s and 80s that would fish anywhere from here to Lake Erie and bring fish back and release them into this lake. You never knew what you would catch in there. What are your favorite fish tales? Who taught you to fish as a child? Where was your favorite fishing hole? What was the biggest fish you ever caught? Well, I'm Boris Blade, and as always, I'm strange but harmless.